Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Patrick Flynn has been a leader in fitness and entrepreneurship since he first stepped onto the scene. He has pioneered and promoted the concept of generalism, an idea that suggests being great at many things, not the best at any one thing. Pat is an award winning writer and author of 5 books, wow, and trainer of special forces, professional athletes, and everyday people. He's consulted some of the largest brands in the fitness industry today and continues to do so in other fields as well. His functional kettlebell education encapsulates his exercise expertise and provides a minimalist approach to generalist physical empowerment, covering all the bases of what most people are seeking, from weight loss to muscle growth. His easy to follow system requires just 15 to 20 minutes per session and produces notable results. His latest book, Strong On 101 Minimalist Kettlebell Workouts to Blast Fat, Build Muscle, and Boost Flexibility in 20 minutes or less, offers a variety of streamlined workout agendas and helpful images. Whether you're a beginner or expert kettlebell user, this book will transform you into a healthier version of yourself. Pat Flynn, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
Casey, I'm stoked to be here, man. Thanks for having me on.
Such an honor to host you. I really appreciate that you and the publisher sent me an advanced copy of your book, which I've been able to read through. It's wonderfully done, man. I love using kettlebells, and to get the message out about how to use them properly, how to pick the right kettlebell. There's so much good information in the book that you included, including the list of fitness myths, which I love, and some nutrition advice. I think it's absolutely wonderful. So congratulations on writing that book. I haven't written a book. You've written 5, so I'm sure that process is not very easy, but you did a great job.
Yeah, well, that's why I have the gray hairs that I do in my beard already. So thank you very much. It's very kind. You know, Dan John reviewed the book, a very nice review. But in his review, he said, this book should have been written like 10 to 15 years ago, right? Where was this book 10 to 15 years ago when kettlebells were first hitting the scene? And I thought about that because I've sort of wanted to write this book for that long. And I don't know why it took me so long, but I'm glad it did, because 10 to 15 years is a good amount of time to really refine your craft, right? And I don't believe in things that are totally different than I did 10 to 15 years ago. I'm pretty consistent in the basic principles, but you learn a lot of things, you know, through hard experience that just gives you that sort of not just education, but wisdom, if that makes sense, without being too immodest. So I'm happy that I wrote this book when I did, because I think those refinements for me are significant. So it's a little late, I suppose, but I still think people will dig it, and I appreciate the kind words.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I want you to hold that thought, because I've been listening to your podcast and I heard you, the two of you discussing that, and I've got some questions around that for you. But first, I want to ask you about Dan John. He lives in my same valley. I've heard like folklore about this guy for so many years. I've yet to meet him in person. I really, really need to. Can you confirm? Does he exist, or he is like in the ethos of fitness lore? You know what I mean? Like, it's such a big name.
Yeah, or is he like Bigfoot, and does he look like me?
Exactly.
No, he exists. So let me give a quick story of Dan John. He's a great friend. He's been a great friend for a while. But I remember reading Dan John when I was very young. I mean, he's been on the internet forever, and he was sort of this legend who wrote for T Nation. So he was this myth to me. And, you know, many years later, I was at a fitness conference. I was actually sponsoring a fitness conference where Dan John was speaking. I was just promoting something at the time. I was just sort of hanging out, and Dan John came up to me and grabbed one of my books, one of my actually early self-published books. This was before I even had my first real book deal. And he took it, and I thought he was just being polite. And he comes back about an hour and a half later, and he told me that he read the entire thing, which he did, and that he absolutely loved it, and he wanted to talk with me about it. And I was like in shock. You know, I'm starstruck at this point. You know, there's a million people at this conference. Dan John's like a keynote speaker, and he grabbed my little crappy pamphlet essentially and told me that he liked it. And so, long story short, we hung out that weekend. There was a considerable amount of whiskey involved, I remember. But we had a phenomenal time. We just hit it off. He seemed to really like my ideas. I told him how much his ideas had influenced me over the years, and we've really just been good friends ever since. He's one of those guys that really went out of his way to help me, a nobody in the industry, just really get started. And he was a great mentor. He refined my approach. He criticized my programs in a really constructive, helpful way. So I owe an enormous amount to Dan John. I I can't speak highly enough of him. And if people aren't connected with him, I would strongly suggest that they get so connected.
That's amazing. Those are the type of stories you hear about him that make me question whether he's real or not. So that's super cool, man. Congratulations on being able to meet him. It's fun to rub shoulders with the people that we look up to in these industries and get to know them. It's pretty cool. So again, you guys were making the point. I love your podcast, by the way. You do a great job. I was so excited to see. There's over 1,000 episodes. It's one of those shows I feel like I can just jump in and whatever you guys are talking about, it's like
Mhm.
fun and interesting and also really helpful as a trainer to hear your thoughts and how you've evolved and refined. And on that note, you guys were discussing, you write a book, you put everything out there, but the book is static, right? You write the book
Yes.
and it's kind of done unless you do a second episode or a third or whatever edition. And so it's pros and cons, right? You got something out there, but what if you shift your thinking a month
Right.
from now and kind of refine, like you said? And so I'm wondering, going back in your kind of thinking and your training, 10, 15 years ago, what's something you felt so very sure about then that you maybe are less sure about today?
Oh boy, yeah, this is a great question. What are all the mistakes that you made, Pat? Well, here, let me bring out the scroll. Right. So first off, about the book point, it's great. Books are snapshots, they're commitments. So there's pros and cons to that. The pro is if you're going to write a book, hopefully it will encourage you to really try and get things right because you'll know that this thing is now it's in print, it's lasting. For better or worse, people are going to see you through this book. So try not to step in it majorly. Now, some people don't care. They'll just throw whatever gimmicks or fads are just in it for the money or whatever. But I do want to get things right. For people who don't know, my academic background is philosophy, and philosophy is just thinking hard about things. So I take that very seriously. But I don't always get things right. I make mistakes like anybody else, and I try to admit when those mistakes are made and course correct when necessary. If you go back to one of my earliest books, the book is called Paleo Workouts for Dummies. Dan John called it a terrific book with a terrible title. It was, right? So this was when paleo was at sort of just exploding, and Wiley, brought me on to write this book. And I told him, I'm like, I don't know what a paleo workout is, but I'll give you a book on like my approach to fitness and body weight training and kettlebells. And if you want to tie that into cavemen, that's fine. There's several things in that book. Again, I think it's mostly refinement around the edges. It's not the core principles I disagree with. We can get into those here in a minute, which is good. I think it's worse if you have your kind of fundamental commitments wrong. Um, but there's certain exercises I don't really recommend or do anymore. This was sort of my youthful arrogance. So in that book, I'm doing like one arm chin ups and just trying to show everybody what I could do. And look, I still pay the price with some elbow tendonitis for these kind of party tricks that I was into back in the day. So this would be an example of one of those things you learn through hard experience. Like, okay, that's cool. I checked that box, but it really wasn't useful. It wasn't really doing anything. Like even one arm chin ups didn't improve my overall pull up numbers. It's amazing how little carryover that exercise actually had to anything aside from like making my elbows scream. So there's many great exercises in that book that I still endorse, but there's a few like those where, hey, if I'm just trying to serve the general population, they don't need to be in there. So I've refined around the edges there. I've also refined around the edges of sort of my proportion of how I prescribe things like strength training to metabolic conditioning, right? And I now tend to put more emphasis on the kind of traditional strength and hypertrophy work, and I see the sort of more intense metabolic conditioning, the complexes, stuff like that is as still very important, but kind of maybe being more like a bourbon to the sauce, if that makes sense, rather than the main constituent of the sauce itself. So I think I've just become a bit more intelligent and refined in how I mix the ingredients, even though I still think I'm using a lot of the same core ingredients. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Does that make
that's a
sense?
perfect way of saying it. I was just going to ask, like, if you could time travel back to the first day that you got your certification, remember, like, you knew everything that one day, and since then you've been on this like downward slide of knowing less and less and less about stuff. That's how I feel in my career. Like, the number of times I have to say, I don't know, maybe it depends, whatever. But I agree with you. The things I think about as far as strength training have gotten more simplified and maybe less kind of sexy looking or whatever, but more kind of fundamentally kind of sound.
Yeah.
It sounds like that's very similar to kind of
Right.
your journey as well.
And I think you realize over time that the stakes are just nowhere near as high as you thought they were when you're like 20. It's like, hey, should I do, 4 by 8 or, 5 by 10? And it's like, I don't care, right? Are you lifting heavy? Are you working close to failure? Are you getting a sufficient amount of volume throughout the week? Like there's the more fundamental things that those are the real difference makers. Whereas like the debates over, I don't want to say trivialities, because these things can matter when you're like at the far end of the spectrum looking towards optimization. But for most people, most of the time, yeah, let's just get a good amount of volume in each week. Let's make sure we're working close to failure and picking the good, most useful exercises. And then we don't have to really sweat over the fine details too
Yeah,
much, right? So,
couldn't agree more. So
mhm.
well said. I love that. Yeah, I thought being a trainer, I was hired to come up with the exact list of the exercises in which order, sets, reps, tempos, rest times, like all of that prescribed. And you realize pretty soon, like, no, this person really just wants somebody to talk to and teach them how to have like decent form and like get them a good workout and be a therapist sometimes. And there's a lot of value in that as well. So yeah, I really love and appreciate that. I do want to talk about your concepts of generalism and minimalism. I love both of those things. But before we do, I'd like to hear a little bit about your personal story. You know, how did you get into fitness, and eventually, what kind of drew you to your kind of, I guess, affinity towards a kettlebell, for example?
Yeah, yeah, good. So I was your quintessential chubby fat kid, somewhere between the line of chubby and fat, right? Hard to make that precise distinction. So I was very inactive growing up. I grew up in an extremely libertarian household when it came to like food consumption. My friends used to come over. They loved coming to my house because they said that I had the cabinet of diabetes, right? Just like free reign over all your classic 90s junk food type of stuff. Remember the gushers and fruit roll-ups
Oh my
and
goodness.
that. So lots of sitting, resting, video games. Was not an athlete. I dabbled in a few sports, but didn't ever really have much of a sort of inherent drive towards it, or much of a natural gift. But like a lot of people who live that lifestyle for a while, you don't really like being like the chubbiest kid, right, in your like circle of friends. And I don't have like some super sad traumatic story, but I was just kind of tired of like being picked on. Wasn't really happy with how I felt. Wasn't really happy with how I looked. So what happened, just to condense the story, is one day, this was kind of early high school, a friend of mine asked me, or maybe I asked him, I don't remember, if we wanted to go try out a free martial arts class, a taekwondo class. We kind of did it as like, almost a joke, just because we were just bored high schoolers. So we go in, it's taekwondo, and the joke was on me because I actually fell in love with it, like crazy in love with it. And the instructor was like super jacked, hardcore, disciplined. I'm like, all right, this guy's awesome. Like, whatever that dude is, I want to be like that, right? So I just went all in for the first time in my life. Like, physical culture actually meant something to me, and I started competing. I tried to be around not just that instructor, but my other instructors as much as possible, asking them about fitness, lifting, eating. How do I look like you? How do I perform like you? And I was very fortunate because, in today's fitness landscape, there's so much BS and misinformation and gimmicks and fads. I was really honestly blessed because the first coaches I had were really solid, right? They set me up with a very strong foundation of fundamentals right from the beginning. And my body started to transform. So by the time I got to college, I was on the competitive taekwondo team. I got a new martial arts instructor. His name's Sam, still a great friend of mine to this day. Sam Sikdar owns the Dragon Gym in Pennsylvania. He introduced me to kettlebells because I was kind of just doing your traditional lifting thing, which was fine and good. But he brought me down to his gym and he's like, "Hey, I got a new tool. I think you might dig it. Might help you be a little bit more efficient with your training and boost you in some areas that are relevant to martial arts." And I just fell immediately in love. Still like all the other lifting, but the way the kettlebell just kind of fit into the aspect of training as a martial artist, it just felt so right. It was so versatile, so flexible, efficient. I could obviously have it like in my dorm. It was easy for a kind of busy college kid to avoid the crowded typical gym scenario. And then fairly quickly, almost immediately, I went and it was the RKC back at the time when it was just one big organization, right? And I think I was the youngest person at the time to ever pass the Russian Kettlebell Challenge, and then just kind of went on teaching and coaching people in kettlebells from then until now, man. It's never stopped. Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. Yeah, like I said earlier, there's something magic about a kettlebell itself and the things you can do with it and the way it has inertia and momentum, and it looks like a everyday object where like a barbell looks nothing like that. It's still a great tool to use, obviously, but
Hmm.
there is something kind of different with a kettlebell. So I really appreciate that. We'll definitely be deep diving into that. Before we do, let's lay the groundwork on what you call generalism. I
Hmm.
kind of marvel, like we just had the Olympics, and you look at like other species and they don't other species of animals, they don't do like 100 different things. They have like one or two things that they're really, really good at. And they're really specialized in that one thing. And they say the Olympics, and you're like, all these humans flown around from all over the world, and in certain parts of the world, they're better at certain things than others. And they all have tons of different body types. They can throw and lift and run and sprint and all these different things. It's quite amazing. We really are a species of generalists, aren't we?
Yeah, I think so, right? Even the most hardcore human specialist is probably not as fast as, I don't know, the cheetah, right? But we can do a lot more things, and we also have that cool power of rationality, which helps too. So my general thought on this of generalism is that for most people, most of the time, you're better off just being good to great, or at least fairly competent at a very broad range of things, rather than trying to be the best in the world at any one thing. Now, if you pick the right parents and you seem to have a lot of extreme early potential and the most amazing coaches, don't let me discourage you from being the next Michael Phelps. But I think a lot of us, when we look at our situation without getting despondent, realize we're probably not going to be the next Michael Phelps. So to not get despondent, you can just realize, hey, I don't have to be the best in the world at any one thing to be a master of many things. I always like to tell people that being a generalist doesn't mean you just have to be a jack of all trades, master of none. I think you actually can be a legit master of many things. You could be truly excellent at many things, because there's a big distance between being excellent and being the best in the world at any one thing. I think true mastery is something that many people can attain across a wide variety of disciplines and really flourish doing so without being obsessed about being like numero uno, if that makes sense. And I actually think generalism is a general thesis for the human person, right? I think it applies to fitness, philosophy, writing, business. There's so many skills that we can have, but I think it applies even more specifically, ironically, to fitness as well. I think for most people, most of the time, it makes more sense to be a fitness generalist than a hyper specialist. So I'm not somebody who ever really wanted to be, the best in the world at powerlifting or bodybuilding. I think honestly that was probably never in the cards for me. I'm just somebody who wanted to be, relatively good and impressive at a lot of different things. I want to be able to lift a good amount of weight. I want to have a good amount of muscle on me. I want to have my body fat be, reasonably low and it still be healthy. I want to have great mobility, great pliability, great flexibility. I want to be able to hop in and run long distances, whenever it's commanded of me. And I want to be able to, I have almost 6 children now, almost number 6 is due in October. I want to be able to keep
Congratulations.
up with them, right? That's very demanding. So I think the benefits of generalism are as follows. It's much more kind of accessible and exciting for a lot of people because it's realistic, right? It's something that anybody can kind of orient themselves towards. I think it's also a lot more sustainable. The price of hyper specialization in fitness is injury. I don't even want to say risk. I want to say the price of hyper specialization just is injury. As soon as you really begin trying to be the best in any one thing, whether it's arm wrestling, excuse me, or powerlifting. I mean, you talk to the people who play these games and play them seriously. It's not a matter of if; it's just a matter of when something's going to break, right? I remember being at a kettlebell certification. There's a bunch of competitive arm wrestlers there, and they were just all talking about their elbows, how jacked up they are. And this is just the cost of doing business as a hyper specialist, right? And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing. Just being a professional athlete comes with injuries. All I'm saying is people should be aware of it and weigh things out accordingly. For some people, that's the direction they want to take. This is what they're good at. This is what they want to do. Power to you. But for a lot of people, that's not what they want to do. And I think there are costs for moving in that direction and just being aware of what those costs are. And I think those costs don't have to be assumed if you take a general approach to fitness. Of course, there's still risks. Of course, you can still get injured just walking down the street. But for me, there's a nice balance there between risk and potential reward. How's that for a start?
It's a pretty great answer. I like it.
Cool.
I wish the younger generation would understand that. You come across people in their 40s and 50s that say, you know what, I trained into a certain thing and way overdid it, and I regret it now that I'm paying the price for this injury. And injury, prevention, it's just so much higher up on a priority list as you go down this road, especially as we're aging. Like having that injury could really set people back, and anything that we can do to prevent that is so helpful.
Oh yeah, and I'll give you the one arm chin up stuff. That was like a year of various pretty specialized progressions to get a move that like two people might care about, right? And it jacked my elbows up, right? I have to do like a good amount of work now, to make sure I keep the tendonitis down. So it's a price that was paid for trying to be, a specialist at something that looking back, I'm like, it wasn't really worth it. Right. So yeah, some things you learn through hard experience. But I also think to your point, Casey, which is a good one, is like there's a lot of other people with hard experience that are willing to share their wisdom. And at least, as I've become less young and stubborn, I've tried to take that very seriously. When people tell me the costs of something, I if I can learn to save myself from a certain cost or pain through somebody else's experience rather than my own, yeah, it's a pretty good deal, I think.
Yeah, that's fantastic. How about the concept of minimalism as it pertains to fitness as well?
Yeah, right on. So the idea of generalism is this is the outcome. Minimalism, I think, is the method or the means. And I define minimalism in a way it's perfect because I don't think anybody can disagree with me. It's just so trivial, right? Minimalism is just the idea of finding that intersection between effectiveness, doing the right things, and efficiency, which is doing things right. And when you define it like that, who's going to argue, right? Who's going to say, "Well, I'd rather be not as effective or not as efficient as I can be," right? So it's almost trivially true. But I think it's an important way to orient yourself, to constantly assess the types of things that you're doing and to ask if you're overcooking the chicken, right? If you only have to cook a chicken and just remember this the other night, right? For 7 minutes, don't cook it for 12, man. It's worse chicken if you cook it for 12, right? Now, that's not a perfect analogy because in fitness, sometimes you can get marginal benefits with a lot more effort. But for most people, most of the time, what we're kind of looking for is what we may call that sort of minimum effective dose, right? How do I get the most from the least? I also call it a sort of bang for buck principle. And it's a guiding principle, it's an orienting principle. There's no like specific do this formula. It's just a way to try and think through how you're programming and what your priorities are to make sure that, what you're spending most of your time and effort on is actually going to yield, the biggest results for
That's
the
perfect.
investment. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, that's perfect. Do you have a tough time convincing people that, like your book says, 15, 20 minutes could be all that you need? Again, minimal effective dosage. Could you do more? Like you could. Would it be that much more effective? Arguable, maybe, maybe not. But do you have any pushback when you tell people, like, no, you don't actually need to go to the gym just 6 days a week for an hour every time, unless that's what you really enjoy and you're not getting hurt doing it?
Yeah, it is funny because there's just this idea that's just been conditioned into people that like if you're at the gym, it's for an hour. And like where does this come from? It's like almost entirely arbitrary, right? Like it's not founded on like really anything we actually know. It's just like, no, this is just what you do. You just have to, if you're at the gym, you have to be there for an hour. And sure, you can make good use of an hour, but if we're just talking about like what you need to do to get results, that's just not true at all, right? You need to hit a certain amount of volume throughout the week, perhaps, or a certain amount of intensity. But there's no reason that that can't be accomplished with relatively shorter sessions, sometimes as little as 15, upwards of 30 minutes. And so, yeah, initial convincing can be a little hard. I will say, however, after people actually do some of the routines and workouts, they're like, oh, yeah, I couldn't do that for an hour anyway. So I'm glad you
Yeah,
kept it on the shorter side, right?
yeah.
Yeah. And there's
That's a
also
big
there's Parkinson's law too, which I think is a real binding law that, work, expands to fulfill the amount of time that you allot to it. And when people are just in the gym for an hour, Casey, I'm sure you see this all the time. Everybody does like how much of that time percentage wise is spent texting, chatting, walking around in circles with your mouth open, right? It's just a huge amount, right? I see it because I prefer to train actually outside of my house rather than in. So I see it all the time. Just so much waste, right? They're there for an hour, but how much of that time is effective time or useful time? Whereas if you know, okay, I'm going to be out of here in 20 to 30 minutes, man, you start shaving a lot of fat off of your routine. Suddenly, your rest periods become much more productive and condensed. You're not checking Instagram after every set or using the bathroom after every set or talking to Bob. Bob's fine, but he can wait, right? So I think there's actually a real benefit to imposing time constraints on your training routines because it will make you more productive and it will make you more efficient with your efforts.
Yeah. Every time I see somebody parked on a machine texting for 20, 30 minutes, I always remember to reframe my thinking and thank the person for keeping that machine from floating out into outer space. If it wasn't for that guy there, that would happen surely. So really grateful for him for doing that. No,
Yeah, that's funny. I'm gonna use that a lot. I mean, just the other day, some guy was raging in the gym because some other teenager was just
oh
sitting
my
there
goodness.
texting on the leg press for like 15 minutes. I'm like, Can't help you, dude. I'm sorry, man. This is just the price we pay in our society, I guess, right?
That's great. Some woman bodybuilder, I mean, she could probably pull this off, or I couldn't. Some woman bodybuilder told me to walk up to somebody and ask how many more sets of Facebook they have, or how many more sets of Instagram they have.
That's good, man. You give me a lot of
It's
good
good
fodder
stuff.
here. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Mhm.
Yeah, I agree. Again, if this is your thing, if this is a social thing, you like Bob, like sure, like you can do that if that's what you enjoy. But is it the most effective or the most efficient, as you explained? I think there's much better ways to do it. So I love that. Let's get back to the kettlebell. Why the kettlebell? Why did you not write this book about dumbbells, barbells? Again,
Yeah.
all of these useful tools, but why did you hone in on the kettlebell itself?
Yeah, so aside from my personal love for it, I like to think of the kettlebell as sort of like the Swiss Army knife of functional fitness. It's great at so many things, even if admittedly it isn't like the best at any one thing, right? Now, I'll qualify that. I actually think the kettlebell is a killer app for certain things. I think when it comes to metabolic conditioning, when it comes to stuff like complex training or combo training, we can get into that a little bit. I think the kettlebell actually is pretty hard to beat. You can still do good work with barbells and dumbbells, but the kettlebell is so well situated for the metabolic resistance training. And for people who aren't familiar with complexes, just think about performing a bunch of different exercises back to back with little to no rest, maybe a set of swings, clean and press, snatch, front squats, demanding on the whole system, cycling through different muscle groups and energy systems, big calorie burn, sort of strength and cardio all in one. Kettlebell might be the best for that. It's certainly right up there, right? But it's also just really good for traditional strength training, right? You can make kettlebells heavy enough that for most people, most of the time, like for the big lifts, the military presses, the front squats, it's sufficient, man. Like it's gonna carry you a very long way for your strength and hypertrophy. You can do the big moves with it, and I actually really like the kettlebell variations. I love the barbell, but I haven't done back squats. Were one of those things that at some point in my life I'm like I don't really need to do back squats anymore. I really just do front squats and mostly kettlebell front squats these days, and don't think I've really lost anything significant from it. Just feels a lot better. Has that the cool kind of uh, element of teaching you anaconda strength, which Dan John talks about because you got to wrestle the kettlebells out in front of you. Great for the posture. With kettlebells, you can train ballistics and grinds. You talked about the momentum and inertial base movements. So sometimes people are a little, you know, worried about those, but properly understood, they're really great for developing all sorts of athletic qualities. Force production, force reduction, force redirection is another big one. So I'm kind of running through a list here. We can see how a lot of boxes are being checked, right? Strength, got it. Mobility, athletic power production and reduction, hypertrophy for sure, metabolic conditioning, endurance training, muscle endurance, and also mobility. The kettlebell is a great tool for a lot of mobility exercises. You do halos, windmills, variations of Turkish get-ups. So for me, it's like the ultimate secret weapon for the generalist and minimalist. It just can do so much with so little. So I think it just sort of fits really well into that bang for buck principle that I'm already into.
Love that, man. Yeah, that's great. And even down to things like convenience, right? Like if you've got the appropriate weight, you don't have to be loading and unloading different things. Like, yeah, like a deadlift is great with a barbell or a hex bar or whatever, but it just talking about efficiency, it takes a lot of time and work to load up and whatever. And with kettlebell, you're like set to go. So yeah, I love all of those reasons. Tell us about the kettlebell itself. What are people looking for if they want to go out and start this and do this with their own bell? What are they looking for as far as choosing the right one?
Great. So I always recommend if you can get a small collection to start. Usually three kettlebells is pretty good. And these things are like nuclear bomb proof. So I think it's a good investment. Like I don't think that you're like these are going to go bad. So even though they can be a little bit pricey starting out, they're going to last you a really long time. And they're not as expensive as other pieces of equipment. So for men, a range, maybe like a 16 kilogram, a 24 kilogram, and a 32 kilogram starting out. Sorry, there's a train that goes right behind my house. If you hear a big horn right now, I can't get it to stop. It's the weirdest thing, right? So that if you're already decently like into fitness, that's like a good set. Otherwise, you just shift down a couple, bell sizes. Maybe you do a 12 kilogram, a 16 kilogram, and a 20 kilogram. But I like three, where you have a lighter one, a kind of more moderate one, and then a heavier one. So you use the heavier one for more lower body stuff, swings and squats, lighter one for upper body stuff. And then you can also mix and match kettlebells for double kettlebell exercises too. There's nothing wrong with having 2 different size kettlebell weights in each hand. So that'll give you a lot of mileage. For most women, maybe like an 8 kilogram, a 12 kilogram, and a 16 kilogram. Again, just arrange with those 3 different size kettlebells. You're going to be able to hit pretty early on all the fundamental exercises, but it will still give you a lot of room to grow and progress as well.
Yeah. Okay. I love those ranges. I think that's great. You write about different complexes and combos and chains. You're now getting into maybe more of the minutia of how we're thinking about setting up like protocols and things like that. How do you think about those 3 things when you're trying to help somebody get going on kettlebells?
Yeah, good. So people sometimes describe these things in different ways, but here's how I understand and describe them. A complex is a series of exercises performed back to back with little to no rest. Really great for metabolic resistance training, which if you're just kind of like looking for efficient body recomposition, this is one of the best approaches to take. So it could be something like this, 5 single arm swings, 5 clean and press, 5 snatch, 5 lunges. That'd be an example of a complex. Switch sides and repeat. A combo is very similar, but slightly different. This is where you flow through a series of exercises 1 rep at a time, but do multiple cycles. So 1 swing, 1 clean and press, 1 snatch, 1 reverse lunge, maybe cycle through that 5 times and then switch sides. So those bear a pretty close family resemblance. Complexes, combos, circuits, and chains. Circuits are kind of your classic. You have different little, call them stations set up, and you might have a different thing to do at each station, right? So maybe you jump rope here, you do kettlebell swings there, you do front squats there, and you kind of rotate through. So sometimes the difference with circuits is they might introduce other pieces of exercise equipment. It could just be your own body weight or a jump rope if you're training with kettlebells. I think body weight and jump rope is a great complement to kettlebells because even though kettlebells cover a lot, there's still certain limitations and gaps that I think can be filled by, doing other things. And then last one, chains. Chains are cool for different ways of getting in more density or drop sets. So imagine you have 3 kettlebells. You bought that set of kettlebells, you lined them up, you do your first set at the heaviest kettlebell, you immediately do your next set at the moderate size kettlebell, and then you immediately do the set at the lightest kettlebell, say 10 swings at each, right? Great way to get in a good amount of training volume in a relatively short amount of time. And you can have the benefits of not just training with drop sets, but also ladders and stuff like that. So these are just different techniques that can facilitate different outcomes when it comes to kettlebell training to introduce, a sort of purposeful variety. And I always want to try and nudge people in the direction of purposeful variety. Variety is the spice of life, but if you're constantly mixing things up too much in training, you lose what is generally more important, which is consistency, right? So there's always got to be that right balance between doing the things that you need to do to actually improve and get better, but also keeping things varied enough to get the right sort of stimulus and also not being bored out of your mind, right?
Yep. I love that. That's such a fine line to walk with people. We have the principles. We know the principles work, and you could probably do the exact same thing every time you do your workouts. But the variety thing is real, and people do get bored of stuff. And so I would look at those as different things to do, but not place one over the other. Is that kind of how you think about that?
Yeah, and also for outcomes, when it comes for strength and hypertrophy, consistency is a lot more important than variety, right? If you want to build big shoulders, like you better be doing a lot of consistent pressing and not just like randomly going through all the different, exercises you can, right? And you better be consistent in how you work in your overload and stuff like that. However, when it comes to things like metabolic conditioning and fat loss, variety starts to make a little bit more sense because we're actually trying to stay inefficient. So for strength, you're actually trying to become more efficient. You're trying to get more neuromuscular efficiency, which you get through consistency. You get good at the things you do a lot of. Whereas if you're just trying to waste a whole bunch of calories, well, then inefficiency is kind of a good thing. Like mixing things up a little bit more can actually be more productive for that particular outcome. So I think, again, there's a balance there where you might want to lean more towards consistency for certain outcomes, but more intentional variety can be helpful for other outcomes.
I'm glad you included that in the book. Like that's all there that you write about the different ways you would be thinking about different things for different goals. So people can really align that with what they're trying to accomplish. You also have some of your favorite exercises. More people are going to be listening than are going to be watching this. So this might be a little bit challenging, but can you describe some of your favorite exercises to do with kettlebell? You talk about the big 6. And we've mentioned some of these already, but can we talk about some of your favorite exercises?
Yeah, and for people who want to see demos, I have in the book not just photos but links to my YouTube videos and stuff that demonstrate them. But I'll describe them as best as I can. The kettlebell swing, a lot of people have probably seen already, but I'll describe it in polite terms because it involves some aggressive hip movement. It is essentially the kettlebell swing is a sort of long jump where you never leave the ground. So if you imagine sort of pushing your hips back as if you're going to leap forward as far as you can and then jumping just through your heels in a standing position where you just come into a tall standing position with an aggressive hip snap. That's a kettlebell swing just without a kettlebell, right? So to make it into a kettlebell swing, you just start by strongly hiking the kettlebell between your legs and performing that exact same movement. It's an aggressive ballistic exercise, phenomenal for the posterior chain, helps to build the thing that kettlebellers like to call kettle booty, right? That's what we're sort of into there. So if you want to build your glutes, it's great for that. Going to strengthen your back, going to build endurance, going to build power. So that's sort of the foundational exercise because there's a lot of hip dominant movements that sort of build upon that. You have the kettlebell clean, and that's a little bit trickier because now we're holding the kettlebell in just one arm, and it's not just about force production, but now it's about force redirection. So as you're swinging the kettlebell, you're going to imagine you're drawing it up your center line, almost like you're zipping up a big coat, and the kettlebell will swivel, not flip, but swivel around your wrist onto the forearm. This is a key, part of the technique to get down to make sure you're not banging your forearms. And then that puts you in what's called the rack position. And this is where the kettlebell's on your forearm and the forearm is against your rib cage. And then from there, you can actually perform a lot of other cool fundamental exercises. You can do the kettlebell military press, and all you got to do there is just move from the rack to put your arm way overhead, right? And ideally going through full range of motion, bicep should be, next to or even slightly behind your ear. And then the kettlebell military press comes all the way back down to the rack for each rep. This is your classic upper body strength and muscle building exercise. Definitely one of my favorites. Also from the rack, you can perform all sorts of lower body exercises. You can squat from here, just the kettlebell single arm squat or front squat with 2 kettlebells. Phenomenal for the lower body. Pretty standard, you just think about just pulling your hips right between your legs, long, tall spine, wrestling those kettlebells in front of you. Don't let them, collapse your rib cage or pull you forward. You want to really just stay tall against that weight. So really good just for that posture element. You can hit lunges from there. So same thing, keeping the rack position, just take a nice deep sort of C step backwards into a deep reverse lunge. I like reverse lunges with kettlebell, just feels more intuitive from that. And then you have one of the hardest ones to describe on just talking would be the Turkish get up. How do we begin to describe the Turkish get up? Well, essentially it's this. It's getting up and off the ground while holding a weight overhead. That's the easiest way to think about the Turkish get up. There's about 6 or 7 specific steps of how to do that, which I break down in my book. I won't get into them now because I've got tons of free videos on YouTube showing that as well. But the exercise is great, not just for overhead stability and strengthening your shoulder from all sorts of weird and funky angles. I really love it also as a mobility and conditioning exercise. I think and it isn't used for this as much, but I found that the Turkish get up, because it was originally developed in a martial arts context for this, as something that you actually do with a relatively lightweight for numerous reps sort of against the clock, is just so good for total body sort of strength conditioning and muscle endurance. So I would encourage people to test that out. I think it's an underutilized aspect of the Turkish get up, because a lot of people use the Turkish get up for like one of 2 things: either really heavy stuff, which you can do because the weight is supported essentially by the stanchion of your skeleton, right? So you should be able to get up more than you can press, which is cool. I'll make you strong. Or really light, just mobility stuff, just kind of flowing through the different stages and angles of the get up. Both useful, but I think the get up also has a middle place that's super cool too, which is for that sort of full body up and off the ground quickly conditioning element.
Yeah, gotcha. Love all those exercises. Those are kind of ones you talk about your favorites. You also talk about carries, which are phenomenal. Why are carries so effective?
Yeah, so different types of carries, and this is something that I will gladly credit Dan John with. He's probably the guy he popularized at least 2 things: the goblet squat, which is just a single kettlebell squat where you hold the kettlebell in front of your chest, and loaded carries. The great thing about loaded carries is that it's almost impossible to mess them up, right? In terms of learning curve, these are one of the most accessible exercises to get into, and different carries had different benefits. So if you think about the suitcase carry, which is just a carry on one side. So you pick up the kettlebell and your right arm, hold it like a suitcase. Great for just the stability, anti-rotational, anti-flexion type of aspects of core strength. So you're going to kind of like get that sneaky core hit in there. Also just awesome because just picking up and moving heavy weight around, whether it's one weight or two weights, is really going to be useful for grip strength, which is important for everyday life. And just being able to lift heavy objects, often unwieldy objects, which we do all the time. So carries for me are something that deserve, or at least should be strongly considered as components within an exercise program. They don't usually, I don't know. And I don't know why, Casey, maybe you have some insights in this. Is it because they just don't seem complicated enough? It's like you asked me about, well, why is it that people have to work out for an hour? And aside from the fact that this has just become a cultural meme, I don't understand. So I also don't really understand why people, like, if an exercise seems too simple, assume that it's not useful, because it's not true. I mean, yeah, it's a really simple exercise. You're getting grip, you're getting shoulders, you're getting traps, you're getting core, you're absolutely getting legs, especially when you pick up the weight and you set it down with a good deadlift technique every time. So yeah, big fan of carries. People should definitely do them.
Love it. I think complexity sells, don't you? Like, don't you think that the big, complicated, sexy program that you can buy with all these different components or whatever, like that, oh, that's the thing. Like, that's what you need. And you won't be able to achieve fitness with just, carrying around a weight back and forth. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you're right. You're right. That's an interesting thing. I wonder what it is. I haven't thought too much about why it is that I guess because people think there must be some sort of secret, right? If there's a
Yeah.
secret, it's got to be complicated.
Yeah.
But the truth is, there's not really any secret, right? I mean, we kind of really do know what works. And in a sense, we always sort of have, right? If there's a secret, it's just getting people to consistently do the stuff that works. That's where it gets tricky, right? What works, we've got that figured out. How to get it done, yeah, that's a much larger conversation.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so we're going through all these different exercises. You've got the videos, which are super helpful, wonderful. Do you have more concern over certain exercises than others as far as safety goes? Like, the listener might be hearing ballistic, total body, dynamic, all of these words that seem big and scary, and certainly, ideally you'd want somebody watching you and being with you as far as safety goes. Are there any of the exercises we talked about that you would really prefer somebody to have a professional there
Yeah.
to be taking them through and watching their form, versus like you could probably figure this out by watching a YouTube video?
Yeah. I go back and forth on this honestly because in one sense, I want to encourage people and empower people as much as possible, and I don't want people seeing themselves as utterly frail and helpless, because they're not, right? There's actually good research on this when it comes to injury prevention and injury recovery. They've looked at people who essentially have the same physical type of injury or disability, but they have significantly different reports in pain. And one of the things that differentiates these two classes of people is how they view themselves, either as being fragile or resilient, right? So mentality plays a big part in how we feel, literally, physically, depending on what's going on in their body. Now, I also think you should work hard not to degenerate your body if you can help it, right? So my other concern is, yes, we should be very concerned about doing things right and having not just good technique, but consistent technique. Because here's the other thing that I think is kind of interesting when it comes to injury. It's not just proper biomechanics. That seems to be important when it comes to technique. But what is increasingly more important, it seems, and this makes sense when you think about it, is consistency of technique under increased demands. So think about this, right? If you're doing a technique a certain way, a deadlift, okay, maybe your biomechanics aren't like your joints aren't in a perfect joint centration or whatever, but you've trained it in a certain pattern for a while. You've gotten really strong in that pattern, right? And then you keep adding load, and then you get to a certain point where, for whatever reason, because it's just so heavy, you deviate from that pattern. And now you're in a pattern that isn't sufficiently trained, and now you break, right? So it's not, so I don't want to say that proper mechanics don't help. I think they definitely do. But consistency of your technique under increased demand seems to be as, if not more important, for injury prevention, right? It's when people deviate from the patterns that they've been training that they're strong at under significant loads that they go to proverbial snap city, right? So I think that's huge, right? Because sometimes people will do kettlebell swings and they're really good at them, and they've gotten strong at kettlebell swings, but then they'll just kind of get a little bit lazy or forgetful, and then they'll put the kettlebell down in a completely different pattern. You know, they'll totally round their back or something like that, and then, oh, they throw out their back. And they're like, oh, kettlebell swings hurt my back. Well, it wasn't really the swing, right? It was a deviation from the pattern that you're strong at that hurt your back. Now, at the same time, the kettlebell swing can be fairly demanding on your back, which is a good thing if it's approached prudently. So, you know, it's also unreasonable for somebody who's never done swings before to go grab a 36 kilogram kettlebell and just do like 20 sets of 20. Like, yeah, you're not going to feel great after that, right? But that goes for any exercise, right? Is that it's always the dose that either makes something a eustress or a distress. So if possible, I do recommend that if you can get a couple sessions with somebody in person to look at your technique, do it. And this isn't just about kettlebells. I mean, across the board, whether it's kettlebells, body weight, barbell. And I would say this about anything, Casey. I played guitar my entire life. I always had guitar instructors. If somebody's going to play guitar, yeah, you can watch things on YouTube, and that might help you. But if you have a coach, that's a shortcut. And the coach is going to be watching you. It's not just you watching somebody else. And so they're going to be able to tell you, no, that's not right. You don't even see that you're holding the pick in a weird way, or your arm's not in the right position. Same thing with exercise, right? Yeah, YouTube videos can be great. They're better than nothing. I do my best to put good YouTube videos out there and address common mistakes, but they don't watch you back. And often you just don't know what you don't know and the types of mistakes that you can be making. So yeah, if possible, spending some time up front, investing with a good coach or trainer just to make sure you're on solid footing, I do recommend it. I do.
Money well spent. Absolutely.
Yeah,
if you can afford it, like, you probably need less sessions than you think you do. And once you learn, it's like cooking, man. Like, you learn how to cook, you're good for life. Like, you learn these skills, and yeah, it pays you back.
Yeah, and not only that, but it's another point. It's one thing to have to learn something new. That's difficult. It's another thing if you not only have to learn something new, but unlearn something bad. Right? So this is when I first started taking guitar lessons, I had a whole bunch of bad habits. And this was a problem because my guitar instructor was like, okay, not only do we have to teach you the good ones, but now we have to unlearn the bad ones. So it's double the work. So in the long run, it might be better just to make that initial investment and get started out on the right foot.
Love it. Love it. Okay, this is going to be tricky, but I want you to eliminate all kettlebell exercises besides 3. What are your 3 favorite, maybe in ascending order, third, second, first? If you could only do 3 for the rest of your life, what would you choose?
Okay, the first one is cheating because it's kind of 2 exercises, but I'm counting it anyways. That's the double clean and press. So the double clean and press is a double kettlebell clean. People can look it up. It brings it to the rack position, and then the double overhead military press. That's great because in terms of bang for buck, you can use a lot of load. It's a really, truly a full body exercise, lower body explosive power, upper body grinding strength. It's phenomenal. Love it. Number 2 is the double kettlebell front squat. So we already talked about that. I think this has a whole bunch of amazing qualities for your core, for your posture, and of course, it's going to help you to build a lot of lower body strength and hypertrophy and stuff like that. Okay, so those 2 are easy. The third one is going to be a little bit trickier. So now I'm going to think in terms of balance. I think people might be surprised that I'm not throwing in the swing, but we already have the double clean. So I think the swing would be mildly redundant. So I think I would go with the Turkish get up because I think that's going to be a nice sort of rounding exercise to fill whatever gaps are left from the other 2, especially on the mobility and conditioning and like hitting weird angle sides. So yeah, let's go with those 3.
Those 3 sound great, and logic behind all of them, I love it. You write about the things we've already talked about as far as using kettlebells for different modalities. We touched on this, but not really gone in any detail. Kettlebells for mobility. How should somebody be thinking about that?
Yeah, good. So first is exercise selection. Some exercises are better suited for mobility purposes than others. I always like to draw a distinction between mobility and flexibility as well. Mobility is just being able to control through healthy range of motion. Flexibility is often being able to access even beyond normal range of motion, right? So mobility, think about this. Can you just get down into a nice deep squat under control and stand back up? That's squat mobility, right? Flexibility, can you do like the Chuck Norris splits or something like that, right? I think most people, most of the time, are probably more interested in the mobility side. So some kettlebell exercises are really good for mobility, would include kettlebell halos. This is great for just scapular and shoulder mobility. Kind of hard to describe just verbally, but you hold a kettlebell upside down in front of your face and you circle it around your head. So your elbows wind up pointing straight up. Great mobility and stretching exercise for the shoulders. Kettlebell windmills. are really great for thoracic mobility and hip flexion. In fact, that's really what a windmill is. It's just a combination of a sort of hip hinge and T-spine rotation. It's not like a yoga windmill, so it's not like a side bend. And I would encourage people to watch a video for this just to make sure you see the difference between a kettlebell windmill and a yoga windmill, because your back is actually staying largely neutral aside from the rotational element. But what this is going to do is really going to help to loosen and stretch the hips, the hamstrings. You get an amazing sort of hamstring mobilizer from this. So in terms of top kettlebell exercises, I like windmills, I like halos, and we already mentioned the Turkish get up, because once you see the Turkish get up, you'll just understand why it's a mobility exercise. Right? It has you in all sorts of different funky positions. You're hip bridging at different points. You're in deep lunges. You get a nice overhead stretch from holding the kettlebell overhead as well. So those would be kind of my top three exercise selections. There's other good ones, but you could work with those. And then, I think that you should have some daily mobility routine. I think mobility is like the broccoli of an exercise program. It's like hard to overdo the broccoli or carrots or something like that, right? So simple flows are really good. You can just do, a flow between these different exercises, or you can just do stuff on the clock. Get ups on the clock are really good. So a lot of times just, hey, set 5 to 10 minutes on the clock and just start performing get ups. You can start with no weight whatsoever and just flow. Don't worry. Don't even count reps, just flow. Once you feel warmed up, maybe pick up a light kettlebell. Might start feeling good. You might even want to just start going a little bit heavier with it, but you're really just kind of thinking about flowing, taking your time through the exercise, exploring those ranges of motion, and importantly, maintaining control through all ranges of motion. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love that. Okay, speaking of carrots and broccoli, you did not have to write about this, but you did. And I really like the way that you approached it. You did not have to cover nutrition in this book. This book would have been awesome standalone kettlebells and left it at that. It's a bold choice, I think, to write about nutrition. And you did. And I really like the way you approached it. I mean, myself and a lot of our listeners, there's a lot of us who are doing carnivore diet, and we're avoiding the broccoli and the carrots and that sort of thing. But the way you talk about nutrition at the end, I'm totally on board with. Like, it's awesome.
Right.
If people ate in the way you described, they would be perfectly healthy, and I would have zero problem with any of it. Can you tell people some of the core principles that you put into your nutrition section?
Right. Yeah. And again, I'm talking for most people most of the time. I actually think there's a lot of value in various elimination type diets and stuff like that. I've done it myself. And in fact, I'm doing the GAPS protocol right now because I was just on a nasty round of antibiotics for strep throat.
Heard you guys talking about that. Not good.
Because I have so many children and they just bring all sorts of wonderful diseases around. So yeah, but for most people, most of the time, look, I wanted to include nutrition. Why? Because it's so important, right? And I know about it, right? And it's been a huge part of my life. And I just felt it would be a disservice not to get at least the core fundamental aspects of nutrition out there. So what are some of the core? I'll just go over some of the basic principles that I think are not really controversial, right? One, of course, is energy balance, right? But this is nuanced because, yes, energy balance is true, calories in, calories out. But I don't really like when people just throw that saying around, because it doesn't take into consideration that different things can affect either side of that equation, including the environment you're in, medications you're on, the types of foods that you eat, the amount of activity that you're doing, right? So these aren't just like static things that are easily discoverable. That said, input and output does matter. But I don't generally think that the best approach to diet is just calorie tracking and calorie management. I think a lot of people get very frustrated with that, and it can be very difficult. So I like to encourage people to do a couple of other things that sort of helps to automatically work out that equation if I think they're consistently implemented. One is a protein target. We know through experience and research that if you just up your protein, preferably lean protein, magic does happen, right? Protein has a higher thermic effect. It tends to be more satiating. So this is one of those things, is sometimes say big doors swing on little hinges is a good saying. This is like one of those things where if you start to push protein up, and I recommend a fairly aggressive thing for this. I think that whatever you want to weigh, try to shoot in that general direction for grams of protein per day. So notice that's based on target body weight, not actual body weight. That can overshoot, I think, for a lot of people. But say you want to weigh 160 grams, get around there. You don't have to get exactly to there, but get around there, right? And that kind of starts to help. That will help automatically, I think, with the calories and sort of other macro balance. get away from hyper palatable foods, avoid the standard American diet. If something has a slogan, you can't eat just one of it, it's probably right. It's probably 100% correct, right? And that's the sort of stuff you don't want around. I like calorie cycling. I think there's some good research around this to show that when it comes to the calorie side, again, you're better off following a cyclical approach than trying to just keep things down in a straight line. What does that mean? Something like, hey, 5 days, maybe you're a little bit pushier with consuming less. Maybe you're coming in 5 to 20% below your estimated caloric maintenance, but then 2 consecutive days per week, think about coming back up to maintenance at least. And there's some good research to show that this helps prevent metabolic downshifting, which again factors into the whole important equation, right? Also, it's just psychologically nice to have diet breaks and physiologically useful in other ways, including for the retention of lean muscle mass, right? And that's the other thing about the nutrition side is like it's never it's logically separable from the exercise aspect, but I don't think it's really practically separable. Like these things are mutually reinforcing, right? When you start eating well and you feel better, it gives you more energy and enthusiasm to work out. When you start working out and feel better about that, that gives you more energy and enthusiasm for nutrition. And if you completely let go of one at the expense of the other, then it all kind of starts to go down the toilet, right? So those are some of the, yeah, those like get your protein up, cycle calories, avoid hyper palatable foods. If you just do those three things, and think about nothing else, not always, of course, I'm not going to make that strong of a statement, but the vast majority of the time, you're going to see some powerful and impressive changes.
Excellent. Yeah, I absolutely love that. I don't know about you and your experience, but I have not witnessed one time somebody making protein a greater focus in their diet and not have something good happen off of that, regardless of how they fill the rest of their diet. To focus on the protein, it's a great way to go. I love how you kind of separate out the difference between the protein versus the energy in the diet. And yeah, very well said. I love that. Is there anything that we haven't discussed about your book and your content that you would like to?
No, man, we hit so much good stuff. Honestly, how it goes when you write books is you write this stuff a long time ago and then it gets published even longer. So I don't even know what's in my book at this point. Thanks for reminding me. I remember I talked a lot about kettlebells and workout design. I think, well, here's something. I think people will enjoy the different programming maps. So I have different programs for different goals. So, if you want to focus more on fat loss and body recomposition, I got a program for that. If you want to focus more on muscle or strength, I've got a program for that. If you really want to prioritize mobility, I've got a program for that. So there's good structure, like you won't be confused about what to do, but there's also enough purposeful variety where you can also kind of choose your own adventure and tailor, the approach to whatever outcome you want as well. So
Excellent. Well, this discussion, very, very practically helpful. I think it's going to help a lot of people out there, as is your book. Like I mentioned, you did a great job writing it, and I really appreciate that you took the time to learn it and get it out on paper. Like I said, I think it's going to help a lot of people, and I really appreciate all of your content, Pat. Where would you like people to go to find you and connect with you in your work?
Well, I appreciate you, Casey. This has been an absolute delight. People can find me at my website, chroniclesofstrength.com. That's my primary hub, and it points out to other places. But if they're into just like YouTube stuff, then I started a new channel fairly recently called Kettlebell Quickies. And it's what it sounds like, just quick, efficient kettlebell routines for the busy person trying to stay in shape. So they can check that out.
Excellent. Super easy. We will link to both of those things. Pat, so much fun. This is great. I feel like I could chat to you for hours. We covered so many different topics. And like I said, I think it's going to be really practical and helpful for people. We'll definitely link to YouTube videos. I think it's really undervalued, like seeing some of these things and understanding. And yes, what you said about a coach is really valid. Like you want to have somebody that's watching you, they can offer feedback, but at least watching the videos is a great way to at least get started on some of this stuff and you make it really approachable. So really appreciate you and your time and everything you've taught us today. And thank you so much for being on our show today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Casey. It's been my pleasure.
It's been an honor. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.